Hello, this is Dr. James Bogash, expert in health and longevity and creator of Bogash Life and Balance. And this is video number 756 in the Mask for COVID and the Pandemic series. Certainly not quite that many, but it feels like it. And it's always the same thing where this is why we have so much confusion in society, is because a study will be released. People will take it completely the wrong way, and they will then use that as it perpetuates as dogma, where people now believe that that answer is the answer, despite the fact that that's not really what the study says, and it gets very frustrating for me. So this is just another example where I need to kind of tease apart what we saw. And this one had to do with a recent article in British Medical Journal, which is a prestigious medical journal, looking at different interventions and the spread of the pandemic. And so people came away with this saying, oh, well, masks, they reduced study upwards. It was like 53% or something like that, or 53% reduction. The other thing was hand washing was 53% reduction, and social distancing, which I hate that phrase, by the way, it gnaws at me, is 25%. It reduces spread by 25%. So you're like, wow, this is great. Masks really work. And yet, when you look at the study, that's not really what it said. And unless you look into the study and check the references, you wouldn't really know, and that's what's frustrating for me. And then certainly I have people that say, well, you're not an epidemiologist, you're not a virologist, but I can certainly read the literature, and I can look and see where the weaknesses may be with that. And that's not hard to do, and part of my goal of doing these videos is to educate you. So if you're not good at looking at the research, you can't track them down, then I can kind of give you some information about why this study may or may not be good. But ultimately they looked at different masking, hand washing, and social distancing. And again, people are taking this as a mask study which it was not, because a lot of times when you put different interventions together, they don't always say what we think they say, because it may be more hand washing, it may be the attitudes of people, it may not be the mask itself. It's really hard to look at these individual interventions because people largely follow. So like for me, when I wear a mask, it's only because the business or wherever we happen to be on a plane requires. It has nothing to do with my overall belief that masking is effective, because I have found that in the medical literature, maybe 1% to 2% difference in the overall spread, which is a pretty small number compared to things like exercise and sunlight exposure. But so this study in British Medical Journal looked at 72 studies. 35 of these were individual studies, so we can get a better idea of whether hand washing works or whether masking works or social distancing works on its own. 37 of them were pooled studies. So the pooled studies, it's much harder to tell because that can have more to do with the attitude than the actual intervention. Of the 35 studies, 8 of those had to do with of the 35 studies they used 8 to determine whether or not these things were effective. Of that, only 6 of them were looking at masking only. And so this is where things become important. There are a couple, just overall, the authors noted that there was a lot of what's called heterogeneity. There's a lot of differences. When you compare studies, sometimes it's really hard to compare them. And you do your best, but you have to admit that there's a lot of differences between the studies, and it makes it hard to kind of pool the analysis and make it real. They also said as far as the biases go, they were moderate to serious or critical. So these studies were done with, unfortunately, some studies are done with the intent of getting the answer they were looking for and not actually doing the study to find out, to educate us. So when we looked at these studies, like you say, well, the 6 studies showed that masks were 53% effective at lowering the spread. But then we look at them. First of all, one of the studies was done in the household, which has nothing to do with you passing by somebody in the grocery store and infecting them or them not getting infected. So household studies have no relevance to the community, which is what we're all talking about. If somebody's in the household sick and everybody in the household wants to wear a mask, like that certainly is not a bad idea, and the evidence is definitely stronger. So one of the studies was a household study. I don't know why they used it, but they used it. But that's pretty common in masking studies, is to use household information and translate that into the entire community. Another one, out of 1,113 people, there were 24 cases. So they used those 24 cases to determine whether or not masking works. Really small subset. The other one was even worse. Out of 5,120, there were 8 cases. Like, really hard to extrapolate that with those small of numbers. One of mask wearing was just part of other behaviors, so they couldn't really tell if it was masking, but they then used that as a study to determine whether masking was effective. The other one had to do with mask mandates, and mask mandates, looking at cases based on mask mandates, is a really tricky little slope, and can be really confusing and make it look like the masking made a difference as opposed to other behaviors or something else, or seasonality. The final one was the Danish mask study in there. And this Danish mask study was really one of the few randomized clinical trials that we've had on masking. And it was the larger one in here. And it didn't really say, when the final data was released on the Danish study, which is relatively recently, it didn't support the use of masks, and certainly not cloth masks, which is what we're talking about. So, as always, I'll post a link to the British Medical Journal study in the description, but just be aware that the evidence supporting mask use in a community setting is really slim. It stays slim. It has always been slim for respiratory viruses, even prior to COVID. So for some reason, we have just gotten this idea that if people wore masks, it would stop the pandemic. That could not be further from the truth, because there was a lot of mask compliance and it didn't really do anything to stop the spread. And we see that when we really look at the well-designed studies that ask the question, they didn't find the answers that we really wanted to have. As always, I'll post a link to the study in the description. I already mentioned that. Make sure you like this video, share it with somebody you think needs the information, and subscribe to the channel.